anything else on this? I think we wanted to do a little bit extra on the Gospel of John specifically. Maybe look at that a little bit more closely, because that is obviously different from the synoptics certainly in content.
And who is John?
And then maybe let's talk about that. So, Wes, if you have a few extra minutes, maybe we'll do something a little bit on the Gospel of John. I don't know if I just want to kick that off for us. How is John different? I mean, we talked a little bit about the manuscript evidence, but when it comes to authorship, is there maybe even, I don't know, is there another level of sort of anonymity there with John? Because conservative scholars will debate over who this John is, right?
Yeah, I think we have the fact that there's a lot of consensus that an individual named Johannes, John, wrote the Gospel of John. But the question is that the disciple John? The early church writings ascribe an individual named John the Elder. Is that the same person? And then you have the disciple whom Jesus loved, continually mentioned throughout the Gospels. And so that's clearly the source information of the main eyewitness of where this material is coming from is this particular disciple. So who is this disciple? So there are a number of options. I think part of the argumentation against it being the fisherman John is that there's certain levels of information within internally the gospel that kind of show that the conversations that the author seems to have access to requires a level of social status that a fisherman would not have been able to get into those rooms. And so you could get around that by saying,
conversations that occur during the Passion Week, especially, or during the trial of Jesus. During the trial,
particularly
knowing that Pilate's wife had a dream, for example, that's insider information. That's not going to be Pilate's not going to come out and tell that to the general public. That has to happen within Pilate's household, and so there's a speculation that someone was connected with Pilate's household in well-to-do circles, that type of thing.
Yeah, or the Sanhedrin, these areas where there would have been a certain level of socioeconomic and religious status that would have been required to have access to these conversations. Now, you could get around that by saying that, well, John is likewise interviewing eyewitnesses, and that's how he's getting information. Right. That the source information doesn't have to necessarily be of one, particular line of evidence. And I think that's valid. I think this is also where there was a theory that was developed, and then I think it was when I first heard about it was under Craig Evans, where the individual, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was being proposed as Lazarus, because the first time someone was described as being loved by Jesus in that way was when Jesus was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and they came to him and said, the one whom you love has died. And so after that point, that's when this character, the disciple whom Jesus loved, starts to pop up all over the place after John chapter 11. And so then the theory predicated on that is that this is actually Lazarus. And so Lazarus would have been of a particular social standing that we can see from at least the status of Mary and Martha being able to host, being able to financially provide, and those types of things, that they very well could have had this kind of social standing that would have allowed him to get into these rooms. Now, these are all theories. And so at the end of the day, we can come down on one decision or another, but we're never going to actually know. But nonetheless, whoever is writing the Gospel of John, his name is almost certainly John because of the evidence that we have based on that. And because the early church really doesn't ascribe it to anybody else.
Again, right. Yeah. No, there's no other ascription.
Yeah. Which is
you do have to at least say that the individual who wrote first of all, there's internally, I think there's some testimony. It's interesting that Peter mentions the transfiguration in his letter. It was something so big that it moved him. And in First John, we were eyewitnesses of his glory, right? The same kind of testimony. Yeah. And if you look at the transfiguration, there's only a few people there. Plus you have the Last Supper, and the one whom Jesus loved leaned his head on his breast. So you got a Last Supper participant as well. So internally, there's some continuity for the traditional understanding of John as the author. Now, obviously, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were followers who had access to the Sanhedrin. So those Sanhedrin pieces, I don't have any, because Nicodemus came at night and interviewed Jesus. We have John chapter 3, the whole thing. So whoever is writing the Gospel of John has direct access to Nicodemus, and at least that story. We've got that portion covered. And then there's some evidence that one of the maidservants in Pilate's household was a later convert to Christianity. So there are, it's not just throw a wild speculation at a dartboard kind of thing. There are other issues that come into play here.
Yeah, and I think the Achilles heel of a lot of these proposed individuals that have scholars have hypothesized in the last few decades is the fact that we don't have any attribution of any of those other individuals being the authors within the early church period. And so if it was Lazarus, why did nobody even think of mentioning that?
Yeah, Lazarus, I mean, that would certainly, I'd have to go back and look at Baucham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and it's not a huge part of the book, but it is in there where he posits yet another John. Yeah. I think it's the John that appears in Acts chapter 4, but that is not John of the 12 apostles. It's a John who seems to be attached to the high priest somehow, or within the inner circle of the high priest, the high priestly office. Yeah. And he's just mentioned there in like Acts 4. And I think Baucham tries to stretch a little bit and say maybe it's this other John who would have access to, as you say, like the Sanhedrin and stuff, and that's where he would have known about more intimate details of Jesus's trial. And that's a nice theory. It does, I lean that way just because the content of John is so different. That it's like, wow, was there somebody who had just different kind of access to different data that would explain a lot. But I think there's not a lot of counter evidence to the traditional idea that it's just John the Apostle, right?
Yeah, and I would argue personally for traditional authorship, and I would say that's a main reason why it does sound so different. So I would say based on the early church evidence, we know that John was the last living apostle. And actually, a late date for John comes from the early church in that it says that he wrote close to his death and that he was one of, if not the last apostle living. And so while late dating for the other gospels is actually, in spite of the early church testimony, late dating for John is actually because of the early church testimony. And I would say that's true. He's probably writing in the mid to late 90s. And one of the reasons why the Gospel of John sounds so different is because he is at least aware of the content of the other Gospels that are floating around. Whether he knows the written source intimately is a different question. He may or may not have. But I think he's aware of the stories that are floating around. And so he knows he's probably the last living apostle. He knows that the apostolic witness is dying out and will die out with him. And so he proposes to write another gospel. He proposes to write another gospel that explains the rest of the story. And he's not going to repeat what everybody already knows. So he comes along and he says, hey, let me tell you the rest of the story as someone who was an eyewitness. Let me fill in some of the gaps here. And the reason why it sounds so different is because he's not interested in repeating what everyone else is already very well acquainted with. And so he fills out and he has a purpose, right? All of the gospel authors have a purpose in what they're writing. And so when John comes around, he's focusing on Jesus's claim to be Yahweh, the God of Israel, who has become human. And as God, he can do for us what we could never do for ourselves. Whereas the other gospels have different intentions in mind. Not that they're not focusing on Jesus being Yahweh, they certainly are. But John is coming in later, and he's really trying to hit that home for a particular reason. And he's not going to beat around the bush and repeat all the same stories that everybody else knows. And so personally, that's why I think it sounds so different.
Yeah, he's writing to the church, and the other three gospels are almost an outreach to the world in an evangelistic sense. But John is writing to those who kind of initially established themselves as believers, and now he's trying to give you more substance to carry your faith. And Gnosticism is just starting its seeds at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that the earlier gospels are really highlighting more of the Jewish fulfillment of Jesus. You know, Matthew presents Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish expectations, particularly in fulfilling the Davidic reign, as well as Jesus being the new Moses, right? Jesus and Moses both come from Egypt when they're children. Moses crosses the Red Sea. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. Moses is in the wilderness for 40 years, and Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days. Moses receives the law on a mountain. Jesus gives the law from the mountain. And so this is very impactful to the early Jewish community. And that's why it sounds like that. His motivation is he's trying to hit a home run. And so John, like you said, Lenny, I think you're correct. He has a broader audience in people who are already, you know, interested in the church community. There's a church community being established. And so he's going to capitalize on that audience in a different way than the previous gospel authors are.